My name is Joan Whittaker, and I was never one for drama. I was raised to believe that good women don't make noise, that they serve quietly, love steadily, and never ask for more than a thank you and a kiss on the cheek come holidays. I carried those lessons like china plates stacked high in my arms, carefully, proudly, even when they trembled. I married young, not because I had to, but because I wanted something solid in a world that always felt one gust of wind away from coming undone. My husband George was a carpenter, not the poetic type, but steady like a porch beam. We built our life plank by plank. One small house on a modest plot, one good son, one old station wagon with rust around the wheel wells. It wasn't glamorous, but it was ours. I remember the first Thanksgiving in that house. We didn't have a dining table, so we ate on folding chairs around an old door George had laid across milk crates. Our son Adam was 3 and kept calling it the king table. That name stuck for years. When George died, the door was still in the garage. I never threw it out. After he passed, something changed in the light of the house. I stayed, of course. I didn't know what else to do. But it stopped feeling like a home and more like a museum. Adam was grown by then, married to a brisk woman named Lindsay with blonde hair too perfect to ever be truly relaxed. They lived just 2 hours away, a manageable drive, and every time they visited, I tried to make everything sparkle. Fresh linens, warm pie, even background jazz playing softly from the old radio. I wanted the grandkids to remember Grandma's house the way Adam once did, full of warmth and soft places to land. When Lindsay got pregnant the second time, Adam suggested gently that maybe I think about moving closer. "It's just getting harder to manage all that space, right, Mom?" he'd said, not quite meeting my eyes. "And we could really use the help with the kids. We'd love to have you around more." It sounded like love. It felt like invitation, so I sold the house. The one George and I had poured our years into. The one with the door table in the garage and the magnolia tree out front that bloomed like a miracle every April. I sold it for far less than it was worth and handed the check to Adam. "Let's make the house bigger," he said. "Add a room for you. Finally get that open kitchen Lindsay wants. We'll do it right." And so we did. Or rather, I funded it. I moved into the guest suite once the renovations were done. It was nice, neutral, with a sliding barn door that Lindsay claimed was very HGTV. I brought little with me. Just some framed photos, my quilt, the kettle George and I bought on our 20th anniversary trip. I didn't want to intrude. I wanted to blend. The first few months were sweet. The kids would crawl into my bed in the mornings, still warm from sleep, and we'd whisper stories under the blankets until Lindsay called them for breakfast. I'd pack their lunches, walk them to school, sew the loose buttons on their uniforms. I made myself useful. I made myself small. But slowly, things shifted. I started noticing that Lindsay winced every time I corrected the children's manners. "We're trying a more gentle approach," she'd say, smiling tightly. Adam, my sweet boy, who once wrote me poems in crayon, began to parrot phrases that didn't sound like him. "Mom, you don't have to do so much. Just enjoy your time now." I noticed Lindsay had stopped including me in the planning texts for birthdays. Once, she hosted a Mother's Day brunch, and I found out about it the morning of when the neighbors' cars lined the driveway. "Oh," she said, blinking. "You're welcome to join, of course." Of course. I chalked it up to stress, to generational differences, to the friction that comes from too many women in one kitchen. But something inside me began to sink, like a pie crust left too long in the oven, shrinking back from the edges. I wasn't ungrateful. I knew I was lucky in many ways. To see my grandchildren grow, to have a roof over my head, to not be truly alone. But love without acknowledgement feels like standing in a room where the lights are on, but everyone has forgotten you're there. I stopped baking as much. My arthritis had flared anyway. I stopped sitting in the living room during family movie nights. I noticed Adam never asked for my opinion on anything anymore. Vacations, schooling, even whether the kids should get a pet. One evening, I made chicken pot pie from scratch. I used George's old recipe, the one Adam used to beg for on snow days. I called everyone to dinner, and Lindsay breezed in with takeout containers. "We already ordered Thai, Joan. Didn't Adam tell you?" He hadn't. No one touched the pie. That night, I sat on the edge of my bed and stared at the framed photo of our first home, the one George and I had bought when we still believed effort was enough. The next morning, Adam knocked gently on my door. "Hey, Mom, got a minute?" He looked uncomfortable, like he was about to fire someone. "Linz and I have been talking. We think maybe it's time you had a little more independence. I mean, you've done so much for us and we're grateful, but some of your choices with the kids just don't align with how we're trying to raise them. It's not personal. We just need clearer boundaries." I nodded slowly, though my hands had gone cold. He meant, "You're raising them wrong." He meant, "You're more complication than comfort." He meant, "You can live here, but you no longer belong." That night, I poured myself a cup of tea and sat by the window while the house quieted around me. I thought about every meal I had cooked, every sock I had folded, every bedtime story I had whispered. I thought about how no one noticed when I started sitting alone for dinner. I thought about the house I sold, the life I dismantled, the dreams I carried across state lines like heirloom china wrapped in sweaters. I didn't cry. Not yet. I just sipped my tea and let the silence wrap around me like a shawl I didn't remember knitting. And in that silence, something stirred. Not anger, not even grief, but a question. One I hadn't dared ask in decades. What if I stopped waiting to be invited and started choosing where I belonged? The house was unusually quiet that Tuesday afternoon, the kind of quiet that only feels heavy when you know it should be filled with motion. Laughter from upstairs, the buzz of Lindsay on a conference call, the distant thump of children bounding down. The hallway. I had just finished folding a week's worth of laundry, a task I no longer minded because it gave me something to do with my hands, while the world seemed to drift away from me inch by inch. I had started noticing how often I was left out of group chats, how dinners were planned without me, how even the weekly grocery list no longer asked for my input. It was subtle, like water evaporating from a glass, but it was happening. That day, Adam asked to speak with me after lunch. His tone was light, but rehearsed, the way one might speak before revealing a minor disappointment, like forgetting to buy milk or missing a dentist appointment. We sat in the kitchen, me at the end of the table, the same spot I had always claimed out of habit, and him across from me, his fingers tapping gently against the wood, like he couldn't decide how to begin. "Mom," he said, and I knew immediately this wouldn't be about something small. "We need to talk about the kids." I nodded, my back straightening instinctively, like I was about to be graded. He hesitated. "It's just... Lindsay and I have noticed a few things lately. Nothing bad, really. But it's starting to feel like your approach doesn't exactly align with ours." He gave a small apologetic shrug, as though it pained him to say it. "Like what?" I asked, keeping my voice calm, my palms resting flat on the table. "Well, for one," he said, "you let them skip their reading hour last week. And Lindsay said you told Olivia that it was okay to eat dessert before dinner because grandmas have different rules." I smiled faintly at that, remembering the moment. Olivia with chocolate on her chin, laughing. She'd had a bad day, I said quietly. It was just one cookie. Adam looked uncomfortable. That's not really the point, though, is it? We're trying to instill structure, consistency. And sometimes, when you go around our rules, it confuses them, makes it harder for us to parent the way we want to. I felt a flush rise to my cheeks, not out of shame, but out of something deeper, something like betrayal. So what are you saying? I asked, though I already knew. We just think, he began, then paused. Maybe it's time for you to take a step back. Not from everything, just less direct involvement. We've hired someone part-time to help with after-school pickups and tutoring. We'd still love for you to be here, of course. Just not in the day-to-day parenting. His words hovered in the air like dust in a sunbeam. Soft, but impossible to ignore. I stared at him, at the son I had once rocked through colic-filled nights, at the boy who used to run into my arms with scraped knees and stories about dragons in the backyard. And now, here he was, gently evicting me from the one role I had left that felt meaningful. I didn't respond right away. I didn't cry or plead. I simply looked down at my hands, lined, capable, hands that had kneaded bread, bandaged cuts, written checks, and held generations together without fanfare. Later that evening, Lindsay came into my room. She knocked once, then stepped inside without waiting for a reply. She was holding a schedule printed on pastel-colored paper, covered in blocks of time and names I didn't recognize. "Hi, Joan," she said brightly, like we were neighbors meeting by chance in the checkout line. "I just wanted to go over the new pickup rotation. We've arranged for Megan, she's wonderful, really, to handle Tuesdays and Thursdays. I think it'll give you some breathing room. You deserve that." She set the paper down on my nightstand as if it were a favor. I looked at it without touching it. "You know," she added, "I admire everything you've done for this family. Truly. But the kids need consistency, and sometimes that means simplifying." I nodded slightly, not trusting myself to speak. She smiled and left. That night, I lay awake long after the house went still. The only sounds were the soft whir of the ceiling fan and the occasional creak of the floorboards. Old wood shifting, adjusting, bearing weight it was never meant to carry. I thought about the word simplifying. I had spent my whole life complicating myself for the sake of others, rearranging days, plans, meals, moods, so that my family could thrive. And now I was being told that my presence was a complication, something to be trimmed, managed, made minimal. I didn't sleep. Instead, I got out of bed just before dawn and walked barefoot to the kitchen. I brewed a pot of coffee and sat at the table in the dark, letting the bitterness settle on my tongue. I thought about my old house, the one George and I had spent our lives paying off, the one I sold so that this house, this shared space, could become more functional. I thought about how, technically, I still owned a majority share. My name was on the reconstruction contract. My investment had made this version of the house possible. I had given so much, and they had taken it, wrapped it in soft words, and asked me to step aside. The next morning, I found Olivia's drawing on the counter. It was a stick-figure family: Mom, Dad, her little brother, the dog, and a tall figure off to the side with silver hair and no face. Underneath, she had written, "Family." No label for me. No Grandma Joan. Just a faceless woman floating beside them. I stood there holding the paper, and for the first time in a long time, I felt something sharp inside me. Not rage, but recognition. I was no longer invisible. I was being erased, with a smile, with gratitude, with pastel schedules and gentle exclusions. That was the moment I realized I had been living in a house I helped build, sleeping in a room I paid for, contributing to a family narrative that no longer included me, and I was expected to do it with a quiet grace, like it was a privilege to still be allowed within earshot. I folded the drawing carefully and placed it in the back of my drawer, next to George's letters and the deed to my old property. I didn't know what I would do next, but I knew this much. I wouldn't let myself become a footnote in a story I wrote. I didn't leave right away. I stayed, moving silently through the days like an old housecoat you forget to take off before guests arrive. I cooked a little less. I spoke a little softer. I let the silence build up around me like fog on a winter morning, slow, creeping, and oddly familiar. For a while, I tried to adjust, to reinterpret their boundaries as an act of love rather than rejection. I told myself that stepping back wasn't the same as being pushed out, that maybe this was just a season, like the long in-between stretch of early spring where nothing blooms, but you trust something will. But seasons are supposed to change, and this one didn't. Instead, things grew colder in ways I couldn't quite name. My grandson stopped asking me to read him stories. Lindsay began correcting me in front of the children with a smile so tight it looked like a seam about to split. And Adam, my Adam, seemed to vanish into his phone, his work, his silence. One morning, I found a note on the fridge, written in Lindsay's precise handwriting. It was a new family calendar, color-coded and complete. My name wasn't on it. Not for pickups, not for dinners, not even for Sunday brunch, which I had hosted every week since they moved into this house. I stared at it for a long time, trying to remember the last time anyone had asked me what I wanted to do on a Sunday. Later that day, Lindsay approached me with the bright tone she used when trying to manage people rather than speak to them. "Joan," she said, "just a heads up. We've decided to move brunch to my mum's place for the next few months. Easier for the kids, and mum's got more room now that she redid her kitchen." I nodded. I didn't ask why I wasn't included. I already knew. But something shifted then. Something small and final. Like the soft click of a door you didn't realize had been closed until you tried to push it open again. That night, I sat in my room and opened the box I kept beneath the bed. The one filled with documents I had saved since the renovations. The receipts, the contracts, the notarized agreement listing me as primary investor in the home expansion. It had been written in generous, trusting ink. I hadn't read it in years. Now I read it twice. The following morning, Lindsay asked if I could watch the kids after school. Megan, the part-time nanny they had hired, had called in sick. "Only if you're up for it," she added, already turning away. I said yes. Of course I said yes. And that afternoon, Olivia came home with a scrape on her knee and ran straight past Megan to me. I cleaned the cut, wrapped it in a bandage, and kissed the top of her head. "Thanks, Grandma," she whispered, just loud enough for me to hear. Not long after that, I overheard Lindsay speaking on the phone. I hadn't meant to. I was folding towels in the hallway outside the office when her voice floated through the half-closed door. "She means well," she said. "But honestly, she just doesn't fit into the routine anymore. It's exhausting, like we're constantly having to manage her presence." I stood frozen, the towel still in my hands. That word again. Exhausting. I remembered using it once to describe George's mother when she stayed with us for a few weeks, and corrected everything I did, from the way I folded napkins to the type of bread I served. I had said it out of frustration, not malice, but now I understood the other side of that word. the way it reduced someone to a burden simply for existing outside your preferred rhythm. I put the towel down, walked to my room, and closed the door behind me. I didn't cry. I was long past tears. Instead, I sat down and made a list. Not of grievances, I had learned the futility of that, but of facts. My investment in the house, the terms of the renovation contract, the monthly bills I still paid portions of out of habit, though no one ever said thank you, the meals I prepared, the errands I ran, the hours I spent with the children. My pen moved steadily across the paper, column by column, until I had something that looked less like a list and more like a ledger. And then something strange happened. I started to imagine what it would feel like to stop cooking, to stop giving, to stop showing up where I was no longer seen. The idea felt foreign and dangerous, like stepping too close to a cliff's edge, but it also felt honest. That weekend, Adam left for a work trip. Lindsay asked me if I'd mind staying out of the way because the kids had a lot of structured downtime scheduled. I nodded and retreated to my room. On Saturday night, I ordered takeout for myself and ate alone in the small sitting area I had carved out in the corner of my room. I lit a candle. I played George's old records on a portable speaker, and I remembered what it felt like to have space that belonged to me, if only for an hour. The next morning, Lindsay knocked on my door. "We've decided to have Megan full-time," she said. "It's just more streamlined. But of course, you're welcome to see the kids anytime. Just check in first, so we're not overlapping schedules." I thanked her. She seemed surprised by how calm I was. That night, I sat at my old laptop and began drafting an email. Not to Adam, not to Lindsay, but to a real estate attorney I had met years ago when George and I first updated our wills. I explained the situation briefly and asked for an appointment. I didn't know exactly what I was planning, but I knew I needed to understand my options. Not out of spite, but out of self-respect. I finished the message, closed the computer, and stared at the room around me. The framed family photos, the toys I kept in a basket for the grandkids, the shawl Lindsay had given me for Christmas, still in its packaging. And then I said aloud, to no one in particular, "I think I'm done being grateful for being tolerated." It felt dangerous, like cursing in church. But it also felt true. I lay down in bed, pulled the covers up to my chin, and stared at the ceiling. For the first time since moving into that house, I didn't feel small. I felt quiet. And there's a difference. Quiet contains power. Quiet can become action. And in that silence, I began to plan, not revenge, but re-entry into my own life. The appointment with the attorney was scheduled for a Wednesday morning, a time I knew Lindsay would be out running errands, and the house would be quiet enough for me to slip away unnoticed. I wore my best coat, the navy one with the wool collar that George always said made me look like a woman who knew things, and I caught the early bus into town, not wanting to risk the car or the questions that might follow. The office was small but neat, tucked between a used bookstore and a tailor's shop that had been there since I was a girl. When I walked in, the receptionist looked up with a smile that didn't ask questions and offered me water in a glass, not a paper cup. That meant something to me, though I couldn't say exactly what. Mr. Bennett was older than I remembered, grey around the temples, slower in his gait, but his mind was still sharp. And when I handed him the manila folder filled with contracts, receipts, and renovation agreements, he took one look and said, "You have more leverage than you think." I told him everything in a voice as steady as I could manage. I explained how I sold my house, how I invested in the remodel of Adam and Lindsay's, how my name was written in as a majority contributor, how I had lived there ever since, but was now slowly being nudged to the outer edges of the picture. "They haven't asked you to leave, then?" he said. "Not directly," I answered. "But they've taken away every reason for me to stay." He nodded, flipping through the paperwork with the speed of someone who had seen too many similar stories. "And you still hold these accounts?" "Every payment for the contractors came from me. Every utilities setup still runs through the accounts I opened. I trusted them. I never thought I'd need to protect myself from my own son." He looked at me then, not with pity, but with something gentler, recognition. "You're not the first to say that. You won't be the last." He made a few notes, asked a few questions, then leaned back in his chair. "The structure is clear. You are not a tenant. You're not a dependent. You are, by contract and contribution, a co-owner of this property, and not in name only. You have full legal standing to take action." I nodded, though I still wasn't sure what action I wanted to take. I didn't want to make them homeless. I didn't want to hurt the children. I didn't even want to embarrass Lindsay, though God knows she'd never offered me the same courtesy. What I wanted, what I desperately needed, was for someone to look me in the eye and say, "You're not invisible." On the ride back, I didn't go straight home. Instead, I got off the bus 2 stops early and walked through the neighborhood where George and I had spent our first married years. The bakery was gone, but the park was still there. The benches a little rusted, but still pointed toward the duck pond. I sat for a while, hands folded in my lap, and thought about how many times I had bent myself into silence so that others could speak more comfortably. How often I had edited myself out of stories for the sake of peace, and peace, it seemed, had not returned the favor. That night, Adam came home late and barely glanced in my direction. I watched him walk into the kitchen, pour himself a glass of wine, and listen half-heartedly to Lindsay describe her day. The kids were already in bed. No one had asked if I wanted to say goodnight. I sat in my room and stared at my computer screen, the tab for my bank account already open. The travel fund was still there, untouched, slowly accruing interest like a whisper that refused to be silenced. I had started it years ago, in the haze after George died. My original plan was simple. One last family trip. One perfect week where all the fractures could be softened by ocean air and sunset light. I had saved diligently, birthday money, tutoring side jobs, even selling my wedding ring once I no longer wore it. All of it went into that account. And now, that dream was dead. But the money was not. It waited, patient and loyal, untouched by their neglect. That night, I clicked a new folder open on my desktop and named it something simple: Plan B. I didn't know what it meant yet, but it felt good to write it. The next day, Lindsay texted me from the car. "We're looking into moving the guest suite into more of a flexible space, maybe a home office or yoga room. Just a heads up." "No. Would you mind?" "No. Let's talk." Just a warning, masked as a courtesy. I stared at the message for a long time, then locked my phone and walked outside. The wind was picking up, tugging at the last of the leaves that clung to the trees like memories. I stood by the mailbox, looked up at the house, and for the first time, I didn't see home. I saw a structure, a transaction, a place where my contributions had been spent but not honored. I had built this space with love, and now I was being evicted by degrees, softly, sweetly, and completely. Inside, I opened my laptop and returned to the folder. I renamed it. Not Plan B. That sounded like a compromise. I renamed it Return, because that was what I wanted. Not a new life, not revenge, just to return to a version of myself that remembered her own worth. The day I decided to initiate the transfer was a Wednesday, not because it held any symbolic weight or poetic irony, but because it was practical. Midweek meant fewer eyes, less family traffic, and enough silence to think clearly. I had woken early, earlier than usual, before the children stirred, and before Lindsay began her usual rotation of yoga videos and meal prep podcasts that seemed designed to fill the house with noise so thick no one could hear anything meaningful. I moved through the kitchen like a tenant passing through a hotel lobby, careful not to disturb, not to exist too loudly. The kettle hissed on the stove, and I cradled my mug in my hands as I sat by the window, watching the light crawl over the fence I had once paid to have repainted, the one Adam forgot to thank me for. I didn't feel angry, not exactly. What I felt was weight. Years of swallowed words and self-minimizing gestures layered in my chest like sediment. At 9:02 a.m., I opened my laptop, navigated to the secure client portal Mr. Bennett had set up, and signed the digital authorization for the trustee to begin the process of reclassifying my share of the house as a managed asset. It was a clean maneuver, quiet, devoid of spectacle. It didn't strip them of their roof, didn't freeze accounts or cancel utilities. What it did do, what I intended it to do, was remind the financial structure of this home that I still existed. Within 24 hours, the co-ownership agreement would be legally reclassified into a dynamic trust, one in which all changes to the property, sales, refinancing, major renovations, required my explicit approval. I did not revoke their rights. I re-established mine. It was not revenge. It was reinstatement. The confirmation email came minutes later. Trust update successfully filed. Control protocols active. I closed the laptop and took a long sip of my tea, letting the heat settle into the hollow space behind my sternum where resentment had tried and failed to take root. Around noon, Adam came home early. He rarely did. I could hear the shuffle of his briefcase being dropped onto the console table, the way he sighed like someone who believed himself busier than everyone else. He walked into the kitchen and found me wiping down the counters. He didn't comment. Instead, he opened the fridge, pulled out the last of the cold brew, and leaned against the granite island. "So," he began, "Lynn's mentioned we're thinking of knocking down the wall between your room and the playroom. She wants to build a meditation alcove." He said it casually, like a man offering to rearrange furniture in a storage unit. I looked up. "That room is still listed as a co-owned space under the renovation contract," I said. "You can't modify it without agreement." His brow furrowed, confusion flickering across his features like a poor actor missing his cue. "What do you mean?" I wiped the cloth once more, slowly, before setting it down. "The trust is active. All structural decisions now require dual approval, mine and the trustees." For a moment, he said nothing. Then he laughed, a short, brittle sound that didn't reach his eyes. "Mum," he said, "are you serious?" I nodded once, dead serious. The silence that followed was long and taut, like the breath before an argument you know you can't win. "This is our home," he said finally. "You can't just—" I raised a hand gently, not to silence him, but to place a boundary. "It's not just your home. I sold mine to build it. I've lived here. I've helped raise your children here. This is not a favor I'm renting. It's an investment I've protected." He didn't yell. That wasn't Adam's way. He just left the room. The next day, Lindsay didn't speak to me. Not in anger, but in strategy. She walked past me with a tight smile and hollowed-out pleasantries, the kind reserved for disliked co-workers or nosy neighbours. She posted a photo later that day of her and the kids baking banana bread in what used to be my quiet afternoon tradition. The caption read, "Creating new traditions, one flowery mess at a time." I saw it. I didn't comment. I didn't like it. But I felt it land. A shot fired under the camouflage of domestic bliss. Later that week, a small box appeared outside my door. My knitting needles, my mug with the chipped rim, the framed photo of George and I in San Francisco. No note. Just objects removed from the communal space and returned to sender like unwanted mail. I took them inside, arranged them neatly on my desk, and stared at them for a long time, not because I mourned the exile, but because it confirmed what I'd known all along. I was never meant to belong here beyond the function I served. On Friday, Olivia came into my room after dinner. She was holding a small pink envelope, clearly handmade. Inside was a card she had drawn with stick figures and glitter glue. "I made this for you at school," she said shyly. "We were supposed to draw someone who makes us feel safe." The figure beside her was tall and grey-haired and smiling. I felt the sting behind my eyes, sudden and sharp. I kissed the top of her head. "Thank you, sweetheart." She looked at me. "Why don't you come eat dinner with us anymore?" I swallowed hard. Sometimes grown-ups make choices that don't make sense to kids. "But I like when you're there," she said. That night, I cried. Not for myself. Not even for the loss. I cried for the fact that this little girl saw me, that her love had been allowed to flourish in the spaces where her parents had tried to prune me out. The next day, I contacted the trustee again. I asked to initiate a separate move, transferring my share into a living legacy asset, one that could be used to seed a foundation if I so chose. It wasn't binding, just a clause. But it opened the door. I began browsing property listings in coastal towns, places with porch swings and sea breeze, places where women with grey hair and long memories could sit under trees and not be managed. I started sketching out an idea, not a fantasy, but a plan, a real space, a real home. Not for them, for me. And maybe, just maybe, for others like me. The emails from Adam started 2 days later. "Hey, Mum, we need to talk about the trust stuff." I didn't reply, then another. "Lindsay says we should try to clear the air. Let us know when you're free." I wasn't. Then a letter arrived in the mail, not handwritten but typed. They were planning a refinancing option to consolidate some debt and needed me to authorize the property documentation. The tone was friendly. The language was masked. The implication was simple. Restore the old structure. Return to quiet dependence. I filed the letter away. I said nothing. One evening, Lindsay cornered me in the hallway. "You know," she said, her voice sugar-coated and steel-lined, "this could all be easier if you just stopped complicating things." I looked at her squarely. "I'm not complicating things. I'm existing. That only feels complicated when you're used to erasing people." She didn't answer. She walked away. That night, I sat at my desk and began drafting a charter, not for them, not even for Olivia, but for the home I might build one day, the sanctuary I imagined when I dreamed of a family vacation that never came. I titled the document, "The Table Reclaimed," and I began listing rules. 1. No one eats alone unless they want to. 2. No voices are softer by design. 3. No contributions are forgotten. I fell asleep that night with the window open and a cool breeze curling around the room like an old friend. The house around me hummed with all the things that had once made it feel like safety. And now they hummed with a new sound. Warning. They had tried to remove me gently. Now I had removed the illusion. I was no longer a guest. I was the reckoning. The house didn't fall apart in one night, and neither did I. What happened next unfolded quietly, with all the weight of inevitability and none of the drama people expect when families break. There were no slammed doors, no shouted accusations, no suitcase flung down the stairs. There was only the steady unravelling of something that had once been mistaken for love, but had long since become performance. It began when I formally declined to co-sign the refinance Adam and Lindsay had submitted. I did it without commentary, simply checked no on the trustee form and filed the digital notice. The next day, I made breakfast as usual. Eggs, toast, sliced oranges the way the children liked them. But no one came downstairs until after the plates had cooled. I cleared them without complaint. Later that morning, I received an email from a property agent in Oregon. It was an automatic alert I had signed up for weeks prior, one that matched listings based on my parameters. Ocean view, multiple bedrooms, open-plan kitchen, separate entrance studio space. The photo showed a pale yellow house perched on a hill, its windows wide and facing the coast. The porch wrapped with faded white railings, and the kind of sturdy rocking chairs that looked like they had held stories. I stared at the image for a long time. I wasn't impulsive. I was 70, not 17. But that house looked like possibility. Not escape, not indulgence. Just a door back into myself. I scheduled a virtual tour. The children didn't notice I'd been gone an hour. That weekend, I hosted a tea for a few women from the community centre. It wasn't anything grand, just scones, coffee, and folding chairs on the back lawn. But each woman who came had once confided something to me in hushed voices or through brittle smiles. One had nursed her husband through cancer and then been moved to a guest room in her daughter's home when he passed. Another had spent years raising grandchildren until she was told kindly but firmly that her methods were outdated. We didn't talk about that directly. We talked about gardening and how the peaches were coming in early and the way modern shoes never seemed to fit right. But between us, there was understanding. That night, I wrote to the realtor. "Let's move forward," I said. "I'd like to place an offer." 3 days later, it was accepted. I didn't tell Adam or Lindsay. I didn't announce my plans or request a family meeting. I simply began to pack. Not everything, just the pieces I cared about. George's cufflinks, the recipe box, Olivia's glitter card, the quilt my mother made before her hands began to shake. I arranged for a moving company. I booked my flight. And then I sent one final letter, addressed to the home I had helped build, but no longer recognized. It was not bitter. It was not cruel. It was simply the truth. I am leaving. I have taken the share that belongs to me and invested it elsewhere. I wish you peace. I wish you clarity. I wish you the grace to recognize what love looks like before it walks away. I left the letter in Adam's office, right beneath the family photo that had been taken last summer. The one where I stood at the edge, half cut off by the frame. The morning of my departure. The sun was soft and golden, the way it gets when the heat hasn't yet pressed its full weight onto the world. I wore a simple linen dress and sensible shoes. My suitcase waited by the front door. No one else was awake. I stood in the hallway for a moment, looking at the living room, the toys scattered on the floor, the half-finished puzzle Lindsay had abandoned on the coffee table. And then I walked out. The driver was early. He helped me with my bags and asked if I was headed somewhere special. "Yes," I said. "Somewhere I can breathe." The flight was uneventful. the landing smooth. The air that greeted me when I stepped off the plane was clean, touched with salt and pine. The house was even lovelier in person, modest, solid, with floors that creaked in the right places, and a garden wild with potential. Over the next few days, I unpacked slowly, deliberately. I hung curtains. I arranged the kitchen the way I liked. I filled the bookshelf with dog-eared novels and old cookbooks. I slept with the window open. One morning, I stood on the porch with my coffee and realized I hadn't clenched my jaw in a week. That was when I made the second decision. I would not live here alone, not because I feared solitude, but because I had known too many women like me, women with full hearts and empty calendars, women who had once been called mom or honey or grandma, and now answered only to silence. I called the community centre back home. I called old friends. I made a list. Not everyone said yes. Some were unsure. But 5 said yes immediately. And by the end of the month, there were 6 of us. Each had her own room. Each had her own key. We cooked together, sometimes quietly, sometimes with music loud enough to rattle the pots. We watched movies and fell asleep in chairs and told stories that hadn't been heard in years. No one asked us to be less. No one told us we were too much. We were not guests. We were the home. One night, as we sat under the porch lights with the ocean murmuring in the distance, I looked around the table at the women who had once been background characters in someone else's story, and now sat at the head of their own, and I thought, this is the family I needed all along. Not inherited, chosen, not bound by duty, built by recognition. I was not abandoned. I was released. And I had chosen where I would land. The letter from Adam arrived 6 weeks after I left. It wasn't handwritten. He hadn't done that since high school. But the envelope was thick, the kind you don't use for casual things. I opened it slowly, seated at the kitchen table with the soft sound of waves just barely audible through the open window. The house was still. My new house. Our house. The women had gone into town for the afternoon, and I was alone with the weight of his words before I'd even read them. The letter was careful, almost painfully so. "Mum," it began, "I won't pretend we weren't shocked. The kids keep asking when you're coming back. Olivia cried when we told her you weren't. Lindsay thinks you were unfair. I think you were precise." He paused there, as if the page had been folded in his hands before he continued writing. I looked over the paperwork. I see now what I should have seen then. I won't argue. I won't ask you to undo it. But I guess I want to understand. Why like that? Why so quiet? I smiled at that line, not out of humour, but out of something older and quieter. Resignation. Of course he didn't understand. Quiet to him had always meant passivity, not power. I folded the letter and placed it beside my tea, and I didn't respond. Not because I was angry, but because not every absence needs a footnote. Sometimes the silence is the answer. Life here moved differently. There were rhythms, yes, shared chores, meal rotations, doctor's visits, but also long stretches of stillness where no one expected you to perform usefulness. You could simply be. Mornings were my favourite. I'd rise before the others, start the coffee, walk the perimeter of the garden, making mental notes of which herbs had taken root. There was a cat now, feral at first, but slowly becoming ours. We hadn't named him. He came and went as he pleased. I liked that about him. The women, my housemates, my companions, each brought something unique to this space. Marcia, with her background in accounting, had taken to managing our finances with the precision of someone who used to juggle corporate ledgers and now found joy in balancing grocery receipts. Helen baked bread every Friday. Eleanor handled the carpool whenever someone had a medical appointment. No one kept score. That was the rule. Contribution wasn't measured by volume, but by spirit. We began hosting monthly gatherings. Quiet ones, just tea and conversation, for women in town who didn't quite know where they belonged anymore. Some came out of curiosity, others out of quiet desperation. They'd sit on the porch, looking around as if they weren't sure it was real. "You live here together?" they'd ask. "And no one argues?" We'd laugh. Of course we argued, but not about our right to exist, not about our worth. One woman came 3 times before she finally asked if we had a room. We did. Her name was Teresa. She moved in last week. The house stretched, accommodated, as if it had been waiting for her. That evening, as we folded laundry together, she asked what brought each of us here. The answers were varied: widowhood, retirement, estrangement, survival. But when it was my turn, I simply said, "I stopped asking for permission." She looked at me for a long moment, then nodded. That night, I sat on the porch alone, watching the moon trace its quiet path across the sky. I thought of Adam. I thought of Olivia. I missed them, of course I did. But I did not regret leaving, because what I had built here was not a replacement. It was restoration. I hadn't burned a bridge. I had chosen a new road, and if they ever decided to walk it, they'd find the gate wasn't locked. Just closed until knocked upon with understanding, not entitlement. I leaned back in my chair, pulled the shawl tighter around my shoulders, and whispered something into the night. Not a prayer, not a wish. Just this: I'm home.